Okay, so we're going to look at the nature-nurture debate, and obviously this needs to apply specifically to gender. Okay, so you must make sure, because it's in the gender topic, we've got to keep linking, remember that L, linking back to gender. Okay, so the argument here with nature-nurture debate is whatever we are, whether we're feminine, masculine, or even androgynous, what's determined that? So the words you want are really, you need to be saying, is gender innate? Remember that word, in other words, are we born with it or have we learnt it? Okay, so if you have a look at your textbook, page 48, underneath the nature argument, basically the nature side of this is that gender is biological. Okay, so there's a really strong relationship between your sex and gender. So their argument is that because every sex, so in other words males or females, share the same physiology and anatomy in general, okay, that that will follow that they will also have psychological traits, so gender traits as well, because their physiology is the same, therefore their kind of behaviours will be the same. That's their debate. Okay, so the idea here is that men are not just born male but born masculine. Females are born feminine. That's their argument. Okay, so males and females are going to be naturally different. The second paragraph you've got down there it says the physical differences between males and females, for example in sex organs, serves an important evolutionary function. They allow you to come together and reproduce and to pass on our genes. And therefore what they're saying is that masculine and feminine behaviours may also be very instinctive. It may be that females are more, and the words they've used there, more careful and more caring, because biologically they are the sex that's meant to carry and then care for children. Okay, males may be more aggressive and competitive because biologically they're the sex that has to look after and provide for those, well, partners and children. Okay, and obviously we've already looked at the bus study. The bus study is an example of human evolutionary behaviour. So what I want you to do is we haven't actually spent much time talking about the aim of that study, but it's down in your text. It's a cross-cultural study, so how many countries did it investigate? All right, how many countries were investigated there? And I want you also to put in the method. The method being, what did the participants have to do? Okay, so you've got a little bit of information there. We know what the males were rated. Sorry, we know what males rated in females, and we also know from the results that we've spoken about before what females rated in males. Okay, so and then we can have a little look at the conclusion for that. There's quite a lot of writing there, but the conclusion is that this supports evolutionary theory, that we need to pass on our offspring, and what is the best way to make sure not pass on our offspring, pass on our genes, okay, to make sure that our genes are the genetic line is continued. Okay, so have a little look at that, but you need very little for that. And really what we're saying is that those qualities that we talked about were important in evolutionary terms to actually manage survival of our genes. The evaluation that I want you to put in, it's the top of page 49, but the evaluative point there is the trouble is this was a questionnaire, and because it's a questionnaire, the characteristics, the traits that they talked about were already preset. That means they're already laid down, and so people weren't able to respond in a way that they found natural. So it may be that you might have come up with what you thought was great in a male partner or a female partner was, I don't know, a quality like sense of humour. But if you didn't have the opportunity to put that because the sense of humour was not an option, then you couldn't select it. And yet actually that might have been really high up on people's priorities. Okay, and so the questionnaire is quite limited in that, and we're going to look at that later with research methods. But that is a criticism of this particular research. So why is this cross-cultural research so important? Well, the thing is that it does help us understand better the nature-nurture debate. because if you find that a behaviour is from nature, then you should find that across the world, depending, regardless, I should say, regardless of what culture you come from. So if something is really nature, if nature is causing it, if it is innate, then we would find that trait all around the world in males or females. All right? But if we're not finding that, that suggests that trait is a cultural thing, and that trait is a learned thing, and therefore it's not something that you're born with. Okay, so but what are the problems with the nature debate? And there are some. It's not that straightforward. Okay, so again, in your textbook, you've got there, what about somebody who doesn't adopt their gender role, somebody who doesn't really fit nice and neatly into their gender role? If nature, if our biology is causing males and females to behave in certain ways, that really can't explain people who are very different in their gender roles. Okay, that's the first point. And the second point you've got there, the other issue, if we just move this down a little bit, the other issue we've got, point 2 here, is that people seem to be becoming more androgynous. And again, if there's a biological cause to our behaviours, from an evolutionary point of view, then how come we are all sort of merging into more androgynous beings, where we have these qualities that are a mixture of masculine and feminine qualities? Okay, and also the third point is that we have evidence to show that actually males and females do behave differently in different societies and different cultures. So you need to have at least, I've got there, at least 2 of those. Can you just make sure you've got something down? That leads us nicely into the work of Margaret Mead, and we did a little bit of this work in class about the 3 tribes. You need to put down what the aim was, what method was used, and roughly what did you find, okay? I would include in that, what the general findings, say your general results, for example, and then whichever tribe you use, Mandagama, Chambuli, or Arapesh. Okay, and try to link that back to the nature, the whole nature debate. Again, it's showing us that if nature is to be responsible for our behaviours, our gender behaviours, then actually if we're finding differences, for example, with different tribes like Margaret Mead found, that doesn't support a nature argument, that supports a nurture argument. Okay, so Margaret Mead was very instrumental in saying and showing that there were differences in culture. All right, a lot of her work was done in the 1930s, and that was very important work to show those cross-cultural differences. But unfortunately, it wasn't that straightforward, and there were a few problems with Mead's work. Your textbook will talk about those, page 50. Okay, so it talks about bias in the way she interpreted the findings, because it seems that she might have exaggerated some of those behavioural differences and similarities. So your text says she exaggerated the similarities between sexes in the Arapesh and Mandagama, and understated the fact that males were more aggressive than females in all of the tribes. Okay, so there's a little bit of information there. However, having said that, there are lots of other cross-cultural research which will support Mead, and on page 50 you have various different options there as well. We've also got number 3, Mead's methods were observations. And the thing is, with observations, they are prone to researcher bias, observer bias we call it, because it is an observation. And that is where you will interpret things in the way that you want, because, and that could be intentional or it could be unintentional. But you see things, and so you've got a bit of subjectivity. So, for example, I watch a group and I might think somebody's behaving quite aggressively, somebody else might think something completely different. That's my bias. Now, if I'm expecting to see person X behaving aggressively, I probably will interpret their behaviour as being a bit aggressive. And I'm more likely to interpret it than somebody else who doesn't expect that. And that's what we mean about this observer bias, okay? That's what we mean with number 3. Methods were a little bit biased and unscientific. Number 4, Mead already had strong views that environment was responsible for shaping behaviour, so that could have led to her researcher bias. It's the same point, really. And actually, years later, she also, having said that that child rearing was a cultural thing, and that, you know, there was an expectation for women to do it, and her whole point really with these studies was to show that actually men could be as good. Years later, apparently, she reversed those comments and said actually she thought that females were better at child rearing than men. Okay. So what I want you to do, you've got a little grid on page 50, okay, with Best, Pontius, Roscoe, and so on. Just very, very briefly, choose one of those and say, you know, very brief notes about why. I've got here why it challenges Western assumptions. Okay, so for example, Best, that males and females are naturally different in their parenting role. That's challenged. Women don't necessarily focus mainly on caring. Okay, so there's a little bit of information there you can have a look at. You will need, Margaret Mead is the one to use. It's useful for you to have one of these. It is a bit of extra work. It's sort of extension work, so you can include that there. And then we go on to the nurture side. Okay, and obviously nurture says that gender is the result of socialisation. So the idea is that family and environment is going to play a role in that. So which approaches would you apply to this? What do you already know? Which approaches do you think might be relevant? Okay, hopefully you've come up with behaviourists, because they believe in environmental determinism, but also social learning theory is very important here. Okay, social learning theory, that children, if you remember, will observe role models and imitate them, and we do that vicariously, so we'll learn from the experiences of others. We don't have to experience that ourselves. There are other key terms that I'd want to introduce here. So your social norms, remember we've talked about this before, these are expected or acceptable behaviours of a given group at a given time. Acceptable, expected behaviours of a given group at a given time. By a given group at a given time, I mean a specific point in time, and a given group is, you know, that could be your own little Fram College group. So that's what we mean by a given group. So it's a named group. Perceived norms are what we believe the group is doing. Now that could actually be very different. So teenagers might assume that everybody else is drinking heavily when they're not. Okay, but obviously that's going to influence them, because if they think everyone else is doing it, they think they ought to be doing it, so they do it, and then obviously it's a bit self-perpetuating, really. A third point down there, the idea is that boys learn to behave in a masculine way and girls in a feminine way from their environment, family, the media, peers, etc. This approach explains why and how someone can adopt a gender role not expected of their sex and how it changes over time. And this approach can also explain why there are cultural differences. Gender will be influenced by that, your culture really, your cultural norms. And obviously Mead supports this argument, so if you can have a look at that and say how that is. Okay, and then we'll do some work on that in the next lesson.